can see a life together, standing by you, and I think I want to forever. And after all has come and gone through all the years, I can't believe the moment's finally here. And you never looked so beautiful. You're everything I've waited for, so much more, standing right in front of me. And we could weather every high and low. If love is going where we go to have it hope forever, let's start our life together. Let's start our life together. Let's start our life together.
Welcome everybody to the next webinar hosted by CHILD, the Centre for Holistic Initiatives for Learning and Development based at the National University of Singapore. I am Robin Milden. I'm the Executive Director of the Centre for Evidence and Implementation, and we are a partner involved in the establishment and the running of CHILD, and I am thrilled to be back. We've been a little quiet on our webinars, but we are back rolling, and how about we just all blame COVID for that? So just before I introduce our speakers and the topic of this next webinar, I just wanted to highlight for you probably the event of the year in Singapore. That is our upcoming conference in October, late October, 26th, 27th, 28th. It is because CHILD is a relatively new centre in Singapore. This is our first conference. The 26th will involve some pre-conference workshops focused on program design, implementation science, and early childhood, and all of that sort of stuff. And we are gathering a fabulous list of keynote speakers and invited speakers, both locally and internationally. So we hope you are able to join us. We hopefully are only a couple of weeks off getting the final program up, but registrations are open, early bird registrations are open. And when I say it'll be the event of the year, those of you that know me know that to be true. So hopefully see you there. What I am super excited about is to introduce the two panelists we have for our next webinar. So these two were brave enough to take an invitation from us to join a webinar where the topic is this: no time to waste, testing, trialing, and evaluating in early childhood settings. Not sometimes the most exciting topic for some people, but absolutely close to our heart, and I know for these two as well. So I'll start to introduce Kenneth and Sam. So people in Singapore will be very familiar with Kenneth and the fabulous work he does in Singapore with NIE. So let me introduce Associate Professor Kenneth Poon, who's the co-director for the Centre for Research and Child Development. He's the Associate Dean of Education Research at NIE at NTU. So Kenneth, I could rotely read his bio. I'll read a little bit and then I'll let him correct it. So Kenneth, his research focuses on the development trajectories of children with developmental disabilities, as well as those from disadvantaged environments, and how their development can be supported and optimized. And he is involved in all sorts of things, including the Rainbow Centre, the National Council of Social Services, and so on. And again, I consider Kenneth a friend of CEI and CHILD, and we're grateful that you said yes, given your schedule. I am also equally grateful that Sam Page, who is the CEO of Early Childhood Australia, said yes when I rang her and said, Sam and I've known each other for a long time, come and do this webinar associated with this centre in Singapore that we're doing. So again, grateful. So Early Childhood Australia, I didn't know this, Sam, was established in 1938. That is quite groundbreaking.
We look good for our age.
Early childhood. Yeah, you look amazing. You look amazing. I need to know what moisturizer you use. Early childhood professionals, parents, and other carers of young children, and various lobby groups to advocate to ensure quality, social justice, and equity in all issues relating to education and care of children from birth to 8. They're a not-for-profit membership-based organisation, and absolutely, I can guarantee, punch above their weight. Sam and I are often in many national advisory groups together here in Australia, and Sam has done a lot of work overseas and in the region, and ECA definitely makes itself known and passionately supports the important work that the early childhood sector does here. So we appreciate Sam, her work, and her team. So we are going to get thinking a little bit about evaluation. And I wanted to open by inviting you each to speak for about 7 to 10 minutes in general around a little bit of your background experience with evaluation, but also just from your point of view, do evaluations matter at all? Is it different to doing maybe an audit or monitoring? What benefit could you get from them? So just in general, your thoughts on the activity of evaluating programs, services, and policy in early childhood. And Kenneth, being the local, I'm going to get you to start off, please.
Thanks, Robin, and very, very happy to be here, everyone. So I'm very, very happy to be talking about this topic. I think the very fact that we are here means that I'm a person that thinks that evaluation is very important. If I were to think back on my journey, I'm trained both in as a psychologist as well as in early intervention. And to think back, when did I start doing some activities that involves the evaluation of things? It brings me back to my master's research. And at that point in time, what I was trying to do was to take a very well validated program with good evidence developed in Australia to Singapore. Now that's a behavioral family intervention. And I really wanted to bring it to and add it to the services that the unit I was working in can offer for parents in Singapore. But I also wanted to really get a sense of whether this is something that can be helpful. So I went on and conducted as dutifully as a student, 2 groups. I had a group of parents who received the intervention first and a group that received it slightly later. And when I compared the results, it showed that there was no difference between the 2 groups. So I mean that got me really concerned. But I think for me itself, of course, that was it sent a shiver down my spine because that was my master's research. But I also collected information about implementation, about the entire process of evaluating. And what I found was that the parents were not using half the strategies. And so for me itself, from that little piece of evaluation that I took as my master's research, it was really trying to understand now why were our participants not using the strategies. And for me, that itself was as important as actually getting a positive finding. And it taught me a big lesson in life about how we should not necessarily just take everything for granted, and there's really a need to get a sense of whether something is working and how we can improve it further.
I want to ask you what the program was.
It is something
Are you allowed to say?
No, it's used in Singapore these days many times, and I think I've got different groups that are using it now. Triple P.
Oh, Triple P. Yeah, we're very, very familiar with Triple P. Some of us are trained in it. And what? Just out of curiosity, how'd that master's go?
I passed. So and the first thing I did was to bring it to the services that was in the organization that I was working in. So
Right.
and I think with that it really helped me to not so much focus on just knowing the manual and delivering it, but really to understand and how parents are feeling about the strategy and to work them and to talk to them about whether they are implementing the strategies. I at that point in time, it was the strategies like time out, strategies like planning, ignoring. Parents were really feeling well. And some of the parents were saying, well, but I spank my children. And that's effective. And so it's having that conversation and localizing it in the time, the space, and culture. And then and once we were able to work through that, we found that it can be helpful. And because it's based on very well established theory.
You know what I think you said, which is really interesting and very important and a real hot topic, as you know, and Sam knows, in both program design and implementation science, is local adaptation. And I think in particular in Singapore, and we find that in Australia here and in other countries we work, that sort of straight importing, no change, it really over and over again has shown to not be as effective as the original trials. And so it's really nice to hear you say some examples. Knowing Triple P, I'm not sure how happy they would have been with that, but I'm sure over time they've learned to embrace the adaptations. That's excellent. And Kenneth, if you just comment one more, and then I'm going to move to Sam. Do you find that the, I mean, you showed a really nice kind of control group pre-post sort of model. How is that different to generally monitoring how a program's going?
Well, I think that it was different because in a certain way, because what we do have is in that study, I was really trying to get a sense of the efficacy of the entire program, and I was trying to control for extraneous variables. And so the reason for that study could have been different. One of the things I keep in mind all the time whenever I'm assessing or whether I'm evaluating is the bigger question of why am I evaluating? What am I hoping to get out of the whole thing? So I think with that question that I stepped in with my master's thesis, it was asking, now, is that effective in Singapore? What kind of adaptations do we need to make? And so that was why the study was framed in that way. Now, if I were to be running a service, now the questions that I have might be very different. It might be, now, how can I customize? Is this effective for maybe this subgroup of clients that I have not served before? It might be a question of now, how can I make this program work? If I were to say if I would like to reduce a few components of that, or what are components that I might want to be improving? So I mean, I think it goes back to the question of now, what am I trying to do? And then once you have the sense of the reason, it changes the entire approach to that.
Your sort of approach fits, doesn't it? That's a really, really nice example. And I was remiss to say to the participants on our webinar right now, please post questions and comments in the Q&A function, and I'm keeping an eye on it, and I will be throwing them to Sam and Kenneth as we go, so don't feel free not to wait to the end. And Penny Love, who I'm very familiar with, hi Penny, such a great point made by Associate Professor Kenneth Poon, evaluation allowing us to unpick results and not assume the intervention fails, but that the implementation of the intervention might be a challenge to the end user and the provider organization. It is just so true that sometimes the program gets blamed for not working when really it was the quality of the implementation that got in the way, and vice versa. So terrific comment, Penny. Sam, let me go to you and let's hear from you a little bit more about yourself and your interactions. And, in early childhood, does evaluation matter? Why? All that sort of stuff. Please go ahead.
Thank you, and thanks for that very kind introduction. I am a huge fan of Robin's work, and I feel a bit like I am an imposter here because I'm not really a researcher. I am signed up. I'm supposed to be doing a piece of research, but it's a little bit behind, and so I don't really consider myself to be an academic or a research expert, but I couldn't help but accept the invitation because I think that practitioners are the ones that most benefit from good evaluation, and we really need them to embrace it and understand it and be part of it. I often think that research is at least 5, if not 10 years behind and ahead of practice, if I can explain what I mean. The research base is building on practices that we're already familiar with, and then it's testing experimental or innovation options for practice that are 5 years away from what we can actually implement right now. And so while it's really important as a practitioner, as an early childhood educator, or as a family support worker or a manager in a organisation that delivers programs to children and families, really important to be across the research and to know what it's telling us. But it often doesn't give us the answers for our day-to-day decisions. And this is where I think evaluation is really very useful and effective. And I think to think of evaluation as both at the micro level, let's test 2 different engagement strategies for families and see which one is more effective. Well, let's test a different way of setting up our environment and see what happens to children's learning if we try it this way versus that way, if we start outdoors and then come indoors, or vice versa. That experimentation on a day-to-day basis, that is really effective evaluation. That's informing your decision making, right up to really big studies, that are giving us lifelong data on particular cohorts of children and what adversity they might have experienced versus what positive experiences they've had, and the cumulative impact of that on their life outcomes. Those studies, of course, are incredibly powerful. The evaluation of big programs like Head Start, for example, have really informed a lot of our policy and our funding models. But there's still so much, I think, that we don't know. Is it better for children to come to preschool 5 days a week for 3 hours, or 3 days a week for 5 hours? Like, these are the sort of questions that we constantly need to answer as decision makers and policy makers, and try to influence the way government investment is made. And we don't always have the answers. And while some of that might come from funded research projects, and we've got some, really important ones happening in Australia, I would say the Kids First evaluation of the early years education program is a really good example, where we've got, really substantial research being done on what makes a difference to children who've experienced significant abuse and neglect. And that sort of research is really critical, but it doesn't mean we're going to necessarily be able to replicate that exact approach in other places. What we need to know is what are the most impactful elements of that. And this is where I think we finally come out of, I think in the 80s, it was like a lottery. If you ran a program that got evaluated, well, happy days for you, because your program then got picked up and funded by government agencies. If you happened to run just as good a program, but it didn't get evaluated, well, boo-hoo, you weren't going to get any funding. And it really did seem very random for a while there in terms of who could attract research money, or who could get evaluated and who couldn't. Whereas I think now we're much more sophisticated in our understanding that there are elements of programs that are effective, that can be replicated. There are some programs that can be scaled. There are other programs that need to be adapted to different settings, and we can be a lot more agile in responding to the needs of children and families. And we've got this little window of opportunity when children are very, very young, to try and equalise their opportunity as they enter into the school system, to try and address and identify any additional needs that they might have. We really need to get it right. There's this enormous responsibility on all of us that work in this area to get this right and to not squander precious resources or precious time. But as it isn't all answered by research, big research programs, although they are important. Some of it is about having a really inquisitive, curious approach to the way we deliver our programs on a day-to-day basis.
I just love that reflection on the 80s, and somebody managed to figure out how to do the clap emoji thing then up the screen. I don't quite know how that happened, but I mean, it is so true, and that's a little bit of some of the criticism of even though they're doing it again. That's amazing. The some of the concerns, I suppose, of the what works, or the clearinghouse approach to identifying the evidence behind programs and services, because often those that have had a longer history of being tested rise to the top, and others that have had less of a history. So it, but I think you're right. We are much more sophisticated now in our understanding of how to answer different questions, the way Kenneth was saying, of how to apply different methods, how to do sort of small micro trials. And we do have this tiny window in early childhood. It is very small. We must accelerate our use to. There's a question here, and it's related to a question. So I'll ask, and then I'm going to link it to a question that's in here. But the other flip side of doing evaluations is of getting them used. And there has been quite big reports, say, from the Sense About Science in the UK, where they made a public call to the United Kingdom government: you must publish every valuation you commission. A lot of valuations I know that we do end up in drawers. Don't see the light. So have you got either of you? And I'll start with you, Kenneth. Have you got an experience or an example of when findings from an evaluation was used well and meaningfully, and what happened?
Okay, I think perhaps I can talk about a current piece of research that my team over at the Center for Research in Child Development is engaged in, or rather we conducted the research some years ago. That's the Singapore Kindergarten Impact Project. And in that study, we were taking a look at the impact of preschool education, particularly in the kindergarten years, on about 1,500 over children. So that was a study in which we were evaluating the impact of preschool education on the developmental outcomes of children. I think along the way we were also looking at the practices of what the teachers were engaged in. And one of the things that we identified from the study that we had was that in terms of teacher-child interaction, we felt that there were some areas in which the interaction could be sharpened, particularly in terms of concept development, if we were to be using Pianta's language. And so very, very quickly, what we did was that we worked with NIEC, which is the organization that trains the preschool teachers in Singapore, to examine ways in which we are able to develop resources for training agencies to support the teachers in their professional development as well as the teacher training. So I think this is taking a large scale evaluation and having a sense of how we are able to engage in some translation of the practice of some of the findings that are a little bit upstream, so that we can support the sector a little bit more.
Yeah, very good. Very good. What about you, Sam? Have you got an example of when results and evaluation have been used well?
Yes, I think to your, so certainly the work on quality early education delivery in the UK has really informed a lot of the policy here in Australia, and we've got some good studies in Australia around integrated service delivery for children who are disadvantaged or for disadvantaged communities. I think there's some good work that's been done there. Often I think we miss the translation to practice because we make it too complicated. If I could be there is a good reason why research is very rigorous, but sometimes we need to be a bit more adaptable when we're implementing those findings. So we might find that something is effective but hard to actually implement in a particular set of circumstances. So we might need to approximate it, or we might need to try another way to deliver that same outcome. I think we need to be a bit flexible around that. I certainly think that if an evaluation has been publicly funded, it should be released and available. It really bugs me when programs are publicly funded and then the results are not released, because that's our resources, that's our tax money, that's our public spending. I think it's a bit different if it's private philanthropic funding or organisations themselves funding their own research. That gets a bit more complicated. But I certainly think with publicly funded evaluations, they should be released. I can understand that people might be concerned if evaluations show conflicting results or poor results, that's going to result in a negative outcome for that program or that organisation. And I think that's where we need a more sophisticated response to how we use evaluations. I was actually at a presentation recently by a young entrepreneurial business success story kind of situation, but he was talking about when new players, when innovators come into a sector, right, at first they fail, and they fail spectacularly, and everybody thinks they're a joke and it's never going to work. And he used examples like Uber and Google and various other tech companies as examples of that. Their first, Facebook might be another one, their first attempts are really poor and look like they won't be successful, but suddenly they figure it out and they get it right, and then exponential improvement in terms of outcomes. And I think in the social services sector, we can be too harsh on programs that might look like they're not quite achieving the outcomes, the expectations that we had for them, or that we're getting some unintended consequences that we weren't expecting. And they need time to work through that. They need time to find that right mix of success factors that are going to deliver on the outcomes. Now, we're not saying 10, 15 years. We're not saying let's keep failing for a long time. Let's not do that. But it's evaluation that can tell you whether what you're doing is working and what you need to change, and allow for some experimentation. And if we give programs or services time to address the problems, then I think we'll get better outcomes all over.
And it sort of speaks to the point that Kenneth was making, and I was going to segue to you, is the what question you're trying to ask when you're doing evaluation. And often we find people try to do really kind of quite good effectiveness research too early, to your point, Sam, where things need time to settle down, the implementation needs to be figured out. So we often try and get people to take a bit of a developmental approach. But go ahead, Kenneth.
No, I think you said something that I was going to talk about, and that's the point in which you are doing the evaluation, and what kind of questions do you ask at different points in time. I mean, I think I've had the privilege of being in a few evaluation projects, and sometimes I feel that if we evaluate a little bit too early on, or if we ask the wrong questions, if we're asking the questions of effectiveness when the program is still maturing, we sometimes find ourselves either being unable to provide the answer, or being able to provide only half an answer. Well, it works sometimes, and so I think that's one thought. When is a good time to evaluate when to ask, what kind of questions to ask at the different points of the development of the intervention. But I thought I'd also like to talk about a bit of the journey that our research center had with regards to research and translation, and how evaluations fits into the whole picture. Because I think as researchers, we are very used to thinking about putting in the research and sharing the findings only when everything is done. But one of the things that we realize is that sometimes it's too late. Sometimes our funders get a little impatient, and I think because they don't in a well-designed research study, it takes time. Like what Robin was saying earlier. So really, in order to evaluate and to be able to have this entire translation process, to have our findings translatable, I think this entire aspect of now, how do we design the study so that we can have some degree of translation, so that we will be able to inform the practitioners, the funders at different points in the study. I think thinking about that, having the right partners from the very beginning, that those are things that we have learned will be helpful as we are conducting studies, and so that we build in natural ways to translate the study, the findings of the study, even from the very design of it.
Yeah, so important. Sam, do you want to add a comment to that, just in terms of building the right partners in from the beginning?
No, I think those are really important points that Kenneth is making, and it makes me think of it's some of it's about the ecosystem, right? Like if everybody's in furious competition for limited resources and the pressure is on to succeed, or you'll be defunded or you won't be able to continue, that sets up a very negative frame for an evaluation approach, and you're going to hoard your data and you're not going to want to share it and you're not going to want to admit any kind of failure. Whereas if we set up an ecosystem in which we are supporting a number of different approaches, it's long term. There is a genuine openness to trying and failing if in order to better inform the way we all work together. Then we create a completely different ecosystem, and then evaluation can be shared, and we can talk about what is and isn't working, and we're not in that sort of competitive mindset. But it's hard. It's not easy to set that ecosystem up. It takes really strong leadership, I think, both from funding bodies as well as from practitioners and researchers.
And a lot of trust.
Yep.
A lot of trust. I'm going to start. The chat is, the Q&A has got some nice action on it. There are some specific things, I think, that are a little bit about measurement and implementation, so I'll come back to that. But there's a nice little question there. I know a lot of the people on the chat, which is quite funny. Hi, Jenny. It can be difficult to, and this goes along with the theme of what we're discussing. So it can be difficult to transmit research and evaluation findings to educators. What are the most effective channels, and how do they need to be supported to change their practice in the light of research? So I suppose this is a little different than sort of trying to influence policy, and now we're thinking how we influencing. Sam, I'll start with you on this one, and then I'll go to you, Kenneth.
Yeah. We need to get better at research translation. Like, this is what the research tells us. Now, what does that mean for your day-to-day practice? And it can actually be really hard to change practice that's strongly embedded, it's not just the quality of the research, it is the quality of the translation of that knowledge, and it is having experienced practitioners understand what that would look like in practice and being able to talk about that. I think I think for us, we would say it's all about ongoing professional development. All educators and teachers need to be resourced, they need the time and they need the investment to continually update their skills and to participate in professional development, and that professional development needs to be based on what is emerging as good practice. It's very difficult. We often talk about influencing initial teacher training or initial education training, but when you think about the number of people in the workforce and how long it takes for initial teacher training to permeate through the whole workforce, that is a very, very long-term strategy. It's much more effective if we can go out with really good PD and get high levels of take-up and high levels of interest. And I think it's also people need to hear it and hear it again and hear it a different way and see it in practice. So we don't invest enough in multi-channel communications to say, well, here's the Facebook post, and here's the tweet, and here's the 2-day workshop, and here's the book you can read, and here's the video you can watch, and here's the webinar you can join. And we need all of that. It's not just about pick one mechanism. If you want to influence the way educators respond to a particular situation in practice, then we need all of those modes of communication and PD.
Yeah, and again, I'll shout out to ECA, Early Childhood Australia. You guys are very good at that. I've experienced it myself in some of your events and things. What do you think, Kenneth?
I think I really like to pick up on Sam's point on how we need to be looking at different ways of outreaching to teachers in the field. And I think too frequently we think of professional developments as workshops or training sessions that our teachers get to attend. I mean, that is helpful for knowledge translation. But if I were to just look back on my experience in my early days as an academic, where I was trying to train teachers to support children with special educational needs. one of the things that we found was that just mere transmission of knowledge is insufficient. I think it's one of the things that is very important is first to be thinking about now who needs what when. It's this entire concept of just-in-time kind of training. I mean, there are things that we need to introduce at teacher preparation because they will need to have those skills where they enter. There are some other times that we find that teachers may not be ready at that point in their career where they might want to be looking into more advanced strategies. So I think it's thinking about when to teach what and when to pitch the different levels of complexity of what you are doing. I think that's the first thought. The second thought is that professional development need not necessarily be attending courses. I think I mentioned that earlier. But rather, I think if we go back to look at what knowledge is, knowledge is social, knowledge is dynamic, and one of the very, very powerful mediums of knowledge transmission or knowledge maintenance within organizations is actually the culture of how we maintain this community of knowledge practitioners within that organization. I think if I were to just take back my own experience, very frequently, I know that if I were to attend a course anywhere, I will start forgetting the moment I step out and start traveling back. And by the time I get into whatever I'm doing, I'm so caught up by the task that require attention. However, I mean, if I were to think back again on how that what knowledge is, I mean, I think it's really how can we get this knowledge shared with the community of teachers that we have in the centers, or if we were in a larger organization within the larger organization. So we have, I mean, I think what apart, if we were to take courses out, I mean, I think time is required for our early childhood educators to really have time to share with each other, to have that space and the trust to examine and build and support each other's practice. I mean, within NIE, we have colleagues that study this approach called lesson study, where we have circles of teachers coming together to examine micro teaching, and they can come together. And so these time that we can set aside can help to build and reinforce practices that our colleagues can learn, can bring back from other training programs that they attend.
Yeah.
I think that's so true. That culture of learning and the communities of practice that we can build around people, and even I was talking to someone the other day who was saying she had moved from one service to another, and at the first service they articulated constantly through the day what they do. So they're telling each other all the time, I'm doing this because I think this will work in this way, or I think this will provide, I think this will provoke children to think about. And then she moved to a service where everyone was silent, and she was not coping, with the sort of silent individual practice, and they had lovely music playing for the children, but it's quite a completely different way of working. And we don't have conversations enough about that. It's not enough just to read about something. To actually implement it, you need to be practicing it and doing it. I can read a book on skiing. I can't throw myself down the mountain. You actually need to practice and build up those skills.
Which is just the essence of implementation work. That's just such a good sort of conversation example of why training alone is insufficient. You got to get in there, we've got to give them time, we've got to provide coaching, it's a real action people thing that we're trying to do. Staying with the theme of influencing, I'll read this next question, which sort of brings us a little bit back to how do we translate, test, and trial. So environment is a contributing factor for our kids and ours learning and development. The urban natural environment, heat and comfort. This sector bridges over to the designers, architects, government planners, etc., beyond the education and developmental health space. Any tips for influencing multi-sectorial and multidisciplinary people across the stakeholders to bridge science to translation, to spur testing and trialing pilots? So I'm reading this question as about trying to influence people outside our sectors who also have a hand in our well-being and our children's well-being. Do you want to take that first, Kenneth?
I first want to say that that's a very, very good question, and the answer is probably much easier than how we can get about doing that. I have to say that this one of my learnings, I think, in the past few years is really that when we start working with people outside our disciplines, we find that we can do so much more. And but it's learning how to talk outside our entire field, and being comfortable with this period of really trying to renorm and speak and try to speak a different language, or be open to people speaking a different language. So I mean, I fully agree with you. This is something that can be helpful. I think it goes back again to the question of what are we trying to achieve. You hear that I keep going back to this, the why. What are we trying to achieve? And if we were to go back to that point in time and say, now, if I want to be looking at how can we be designing a space that can be helpful for our children to learn, and then through that goal, I mean, I think that's when we start to ask ourselves, now, how do we design an event, a trial, or how do we design something that will allow us to answer our questions? Too often I find evaluation programs being omnibus kind of programs where we want to be evaluating everything. I think what happens is that it becomes very expensive. It becomes very slow. So I think evaluation can be more nimble if we can be very targeted in the kind of questions that we ask. And so once we have a sense of what we want to do, we is bringing the team together to really think about, now, how can we go about design? What do we want to put in place? And what are the key elements that we think might be helpful for us to take note of as we are trying to implement something like that? I'm not sure whether this is something that is half an idea that we can get us started about thinking about how can we go about progressing further.
Yeah. Sam?
I did some fascinating training a few years ago on conflict resolution, and it was really about conflict resolution in international diplomacy and UN Security Council kind of stuff, which is worlds apart from my day-to-day job. Except what I realised is that there's so much we can learn from that in relation to understanding that that in the context of the UN, bear with me, okay, in the context of the UN, every nation has a different cultural background, a different set of priorities, and they're coming to the table needing an outcome for their country. And if you want to get a win for your country, you need to understand what everybody else is there for, and then you need to find out, well, whose interests align with whose, and build those positive relationships, and who's going to try and stop you because they've got an opposite agenda, or they're looking to spoil certain outcomes. And you need to negotiate in a way that you're very sure about your bottom line, what you're trying to achieve, but you also understand what everybody else is trying to achieve. And as much as possible, you're trying to come out of that with win-win outcomes, so the other person gets what they need and you get what you need. And I know this sounds really simplistic, like, oh, of course, but actually that's not how we usually work, right? When we do advocacy, or when we go and see government for funding, or we go to negotiate with a professional from a different discipline, we go in there with our arguments all lined up. This is what you need to understand about me. This is what you need to do. This is what I need from you. We don't do enough to sit down and think, what do they need? What are they looking for? What do I have to offer them? And if we did more of that, particularly in a cross-disciplinary sense, I think we could get better outcomes. So the example I would use from the early childhood sector is early intervention therapists working with children and early childhood services. There used to be a real clash between early intervention services wanting to take the child away and work with that child individually, and then come back and tell the educator, you must follow up this program by working with this child individually in this way, which doesn't fit at all with the way an early childhood service operates. And the idea that an educator has the capacity to go into another room with this one child and leave the other children unsupervised while they do that, it doesn't work. But once we have a conversation between the two sectors, we start using the same language and we understand each other and what we're trying to achieve, we can actually work in an entirely different way, where the early intervention therapist can give the educator the skills and the knowledge that they need to build into the program for all of the children the kind of interventions that they were that are really going to matter for one of those children. And everybody benefits from that. All the children will benefit from more of whether it's speech on particular sounds, or whether reading particular stories that can have that sound, and using rhymes and games to practice that sound. Nobody's missing out, but that child is getting what they need in the context of the group setting and the way the educator works. But it really does take goodwill on both sides to come together and find the common language, the common outcome. Kenneth's point about we need to know what we're trying to achieve here. We all have the same objective, and that is for this child to have the intervention that they need. But there are different ways of delivering it. And if we know what both parties need, we can get a better outcome.
What I got to say I love about that, Sam, is that you just compared early childhood sector to UN Security Council work.
Well, what I did come to realise is that the Australian Parliament is a bit like the UN Security Council. When you start to think of it like that, it makes much more sense.
Which is why I prefer working in Singapore on so many levels. I'm going to take us back just a little bit because there's a few themes. I'm going to encourage a couple of the questions. So there's a question specific to an implementation framework that might help with evaluation. You've come up as anonymous, which is totally fine. I would encourage you to email myself or Kenneth or the child team. That would be a very easy piece of assistance we could help you in terms of, there's lots of good implementation frameworks that can help you with evaluation. It goes back to the point Kenneth is making that it really depends what you're trying to achieve and what questions. So I can see that, and we are here. And there is another couple of specific ones around measuring implementation and how do we do that, particularly for you, Kenneth. And I think that's somebody who looks like they know you. And I think what we can do there is encourage you to get in touch with Kenneth, simply because I think his answer is going to be, it depends what you're doing, and how you measure and the resource. And, so... But there's a nice long message that you two will have to focus on, because I'm going to read it from a very wonderful person who we haven't seen for a while. Hi, Pippa, who is a very senior person in the Victorian state education. So I think the question of program evaluation is really interesting, particularly around investment. One of the things we've been thinking about is how you identify the specific elements of practice within a program that drive outcomes. There's a number of reviews that have done this. We on Child and at Centre for Evidence Implementation are doing an enormous amount of work on these elements work to improve social emotional development, executive functioning and behavioural, as opposed to doing sort of structured programs. Appreciating this may reduce engagement with specific programs, which program owners may find challenging. My question to the panel is, how do we support research and evaluation that is able to draw the most impactful practice elements of a program out? And then how can we universally share that? So I suppose, Sam and Kenneth, this is getting to this next wave of intervention design and implementation, which is this practice elements components work that I know a lot of us are working on. Sam, you want to take that first and make a few comments, and then Kenneth, you go ahead.
Oh, look, it's an excellent question. I mean, I think it's Kenneth's point about getting the right questions. What are the questions that we want to know? And if I think back to the early days of local area coordination in disability sector, I'm sorry, I'm going outside early childhood again, but local area coordination emerged very quickly as a really effective way of supporting people to navigate the disability sector and to understand what supports were available and to match people to programs. But it also informed programs about what people really needed, because it wasn't just apply for this program and get it or not get it. It was asking the question of what do you need to function in your life? And so there was this sort of very two-way interaction in terms of the benefits that program was delivering. And it was evaluated, and it was evaluated again, it was replicated, it was evaluated. But I think it then got implemented at scale, and we kind of lost something. We lost the intimate knowledge of the individual person in the system, which was the key element of the coordinator role. And so we thought the coordinator role was all about professional expertise and knowing what all the programs were and being able to fill out application forms. But actually, the real skill of the coordinator is the empathy and the understanding of what that person needs and what their challenges are in life. And we're seeing that increasingly in research that's pointing at human service delivery, that it's the relationship between the practitioner and the program or service user that matters the most. And we often don't measure that when we evaluate programs and services. And so we need to measure that relationship better and ask the right questions about what matters to you. What drew you to this program? What did you get out of this program? What do you think mattered the most about that? Getting the questions right, I think, which Kenneth has already said in a much more articulate way than me.
Well, go ahead, Kenneth.
I can't imagine
you can
myself
be more articulate.
But I think if I was to approach it from the angle of research, there is a tendency for us to apply research from a top-down way, or how we have been talking about it is thinking about how we can bring research to practice. I think increasingly as we start thinking about research in the field is that many of us actually do realize that our colleagues who are the practitioners on the ground really engage in many pockets of good practice. So approaching research from a strictly, top-down, we have big studies and then we try to implement what the active elements into programs. Now, that is one way to go. I think we are also learning that there can also be research into practice, where practitioners might have an intuitive understanding of what could be helpful. And if we can have consensus built around these practices, which practitioners hold so dear as something that is very impactful, we can hone in, guided by experienced practitioners, guided by the wisdom of the field, and then mount relatively more targeted studies to examine these elements. So, I think that and again, it brings us to this partnership that needs to be developed between the researchers and practitioners, as well as the regulators and the funders, so that we start to really have this understanding that both research and practice can learn from each other. And in fact, when we bring both together, it becomes synergistic. So I think that is the broad philosophy which I think we are trying more and more to engage in, to just move away from the view that the researchers know better. And I think as a researcher, I have to keep telling myself all the time that I don't necessarily know better. I don't know better because my colleagues have been out in the trenches, are really working, and I think it's building on that understanding that we can learn and inform the sector.
Can I jump in? I know we're running out of time, but I just did a whole load of reading on accountability and organisational accountability, and there was a lot of talk about that accountability upwards to owners and funders and members and people who own you, and then accountability downwards to the service users, the families, the children, the people that you're responsible to. But the bit that is now emerging as really important is the internal accountability, the people who work in your organisation who are doing the work, that they are accountable to each other, and that the accountability is interactive between the funders, the service recipients, and the people who are actually delivering the program. And sometimes the people delivering the program are getting good outcomes in spite of bad programs or bad decisions that have been made, or sometimes they're actually we're changing practice in a positive way because of the accountability mechanisms that are in place. But all three layers are important, I guess, is all I wanted to add.
Yep. Well, let's have you guys bring us home on a classic but super important question that somebody's posted. How can we encourage a culture of sharing evaluation findings and learnings from what failed? Sam, I'm going to start with you, and I'm going to give Kenneth the final word.
I think it's about that ecosystem of saying this isn't about pass or fail. It's not that you're going to keep your funding or lose your funding. It's not those kind of high stake decisions pending evaluation outcomes is, I think, where we went a bit wrong, Robin, in the 80s. Whereas I think now if we say, okay, we're going to lock these programs in, we're going to stay with them until they're successful, and we're going to allow them to learn through evaluation and share that information. That's the best thing we can do. And as you said, it requires a lot of trust that we've got the right ethics and the right values in our approach to services, that we've all got the same objectives and intentions, and that we're making the best possible use of the resources available.
Yeah. Kenneth, bring us home. How do we do that in Singapore?
Or rather, how I think it can be done in Singapore. And I think I'll build on Sam's point of trust. I think there needs to be trust within the ecosystem, between the funders, between the researchers, as well as with stakeholders, particularly practitioners. I think that trust in, first of all, that not having good grades, using a very Singapore term, with evaluation means that the program will no longer be funded. I think I started with a story that the lack of positive outcomes does not necessarily mean that the program is not working. It just means that we have to study further. So I think first of all, having the trust that we need to be in an ecosystem that needs to be able to learn from mistakes. I think from the perspective of program designers, not to launch into a full program and scale up too fast, because sometimes when that happens, we find that the program might have progressed too fast in order for it to fail, if I can use the local word, with face. So that but rather we need to have a nimble program design so that we have certain points in time in which we will be able to take stock and to make the changes. Finally, I think among the program funders, I think one possibility is to build in an approach that allows programs to make tweaks along the way, so that when programs see findings that are not rosy to start off with, it gives them a chance to change and make amendments midway through a funding cycle. That will not put them afoul of deviating from program objectives. I mean, so I think it's partly program design. It's also partly flexibility on part of how we fund programs that will allow these key inflection points for us to consider how we can improve the program further. So I think the end point then is not a program that is successful, but a program that is continually improving and evolving.
It's like the dream world. We've got to do it before we all quit. We've got to do it. It's just come on. We've got, we're halfway there. But terrific. The two of you, I am, on behalf of Child, we are very, very grateful for your time and lending us your thoughts and your brain today. I am finding the emoji thing we haven't had this before on our webinars. There's like a lot of floating things. There's obviously some young people on this that know how to use those buttons. But thank you, both of you, very, very much. Thank you to the participants. Thank you, people that asked questions. They were great. I'm sorry I couldn't get to them all. Please feel free to come to Kenneth and I for anything specific. And don't forget the event of the year at the end of October, our conference, which will be hybrid and in person. And watch out as we continue to announce our speakers. And have a fabulous Friday.
Look in your eyes and I can see a life together. Standing by you and I